Hello, everybody, and welcome to UCL's Lunch Hour lecture. My name is Uta Steiger. I'm heading the European Institute here at UCL, and I'm very pleased to welcome you all to today's lecture. I recall a time when doing research on Europe, and particularly the European Union, was considered a rather niche occupation in this country. I think we can safely say that Europe has sort of moved out of its niche by now. Interestingly, of course, just as we are leaving the EU, everybody seems to be interested in it today, and also everybody seems to have become quite an expert on it. So it's my particular pleasure, and against all of this background noise, that we have someone here today with us who's been paying rather close attention to Europe for a rather very long time, and who's quite renowned for considered and out-of-the-box thinking on the issue. Professor George Letsas holds a chair of the philosophy of law in the UCL Faculty of Laws, as you would expect. He is also co-director of the UCL Institute for Human Rights and co-editor of UCL's Quain lecture series in jurisprudence, published by Oxford University Press. He's a UCL man through and through, as I rediscovered, because he has already done his PhD at the faculty of which he is now Vice Dean. George's main research interests are in the philosophy of law and jurisprudence and human rights, specifically also the interpretation of the European Convention on Human Rights, the theory of European law and private law, and the philosophical foundations of contract law, among others. And he will talk to us today about the ethicality, or not, of Euroscepticism. And he's pointed out that he's actually got a piece out in the London Review of Books on Brexit and the Constitution, which is related to his talk today. So if that's something that you want to be exploring further, then do look that one up. With that, over to you, George.
Thank you, Uta, and thank you all for coming here today. My topic is whether Euroscepticism is unethical or not. And as Uta mentioned, I am a legal philosopher. So I want to say a few things about my job. My job is to explore questions about the connection between law and justice, ask questions about whether we have a duty to obey the law, and what makes a legal system just. So asking whether Euroscepticism is unethical is actually part of what I do, part of why I'm paid to write on. And I have to also say I'm very proud to be at UCL, which has a long history of distinction in the field of legal philosophy, going all the way back to our spiritual father, Jeremy Bentham. Jeremy Bentham was not just a philosopher, he was also a political activist and a reformer. So reflecting on questions of law and justice and thinking about how they apply to everyday life is part of UCL's history. So I'm very proud to be part of that tradition. Now, before I say anything about my question, I want to begin with definitions. So is Euroscepticism unethical? What do I mean by Euroscepticism? What do I mean by unethical? And the way I want to define Euroscepticism is as follows. It's the active undermining of supranational European institutions, or the refusal to support them when support is crucial. So I have in mind here actions, conduct, as opposed to beliefs or attitudes. One could hold Eurosceptic attitudes and beliefs, and this could be unethical, like any belief can be unethical, but I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in action and conduct. And conduct can be either that of institutions, like a government, or it could be that of people, like people in this room, and it can take many forms, from how you spend your time supporting the various causes, or how you vote. For example, voting is an action with effects in the world. So I'm interested in conduct that either undermines or fails to support European supranational institutions. What do I mean by European supranational institutions? So clearly the EU, the European Union, but not only. I also mean other organizations like the Council of Europe and the European Convention on Human Rights, which is separate from the EU. Okay, now that I have defined Euroscepticism, what do I mean by unethical? So here I mean conduct which is in violation of moral principles that all reasonable people would recognize. And it's not just any violation of a moral principle, but one that leads to wrongdoing. So we need a wrong or an injustice done by one person upon another. So when I ask, is Euroscepticism unethical, I'd better find who is being the wrongdoer and who is being the victim. Okay? So that's what I mean by unethical. I mean an injustice done on someone. These are my terms. This is how I'm going to proceed. And before I say anything about Euroscepticism or European institutions, I want to give you a few stories about myself, things that happened to me last week, which I hope you may find interesting. Bear with me, they don't seem to have much connection to the topic, but they will eventually. So last week I was walking my son to school. I live in the center, so I walk him to school. And on the way to the school, there was a motorbike, massive one, with the engine on. And the driver was speaking on the phone. The engine was quite loud. It was one of those massive motorbikes. And I ignored him and continued, dropped my son off, and on my way back, something like 20 minutes later, 25 minutes, the engine was still on. Now with the driver pedaling the accelerator, making even more noise, same time as he's still talking on the phone. So concerned as I am about the problem of air pollution and noise pollution, I just couldn't help not stopping and asking him, do you mind switching off the engine? To which he replied, why? And then I said, well, because it's causing unnecessary air and noise pollution. To which he replied, I don't care. Then I was kind of less speechless. And I wanted to say a number of things to him, like, well, I don't do any of those things. I don't have a car. I don't have a vehicle. I don't pollute. I try to be green in my every day-to-day life to reduce emissions, to have cleaner air. And there you go, polluting unnecessarily, increasing toxic air and noise pollution for no reason, whereas everybody, people who live here, making sacrifices. So I was kind of trying to say to him, well, actually, you're being a bit unfair here. You're kind of enjoying benefits of us not polluting, and you're not doing your fair share. But I didn't say any of that, because that would have taken a while to explain. Instead, I said, it's also against the law, you know. It's illegal what you're doing. To which he replied, well, if it's illegal, then call the police and I'll pay the fine. So at that point, I thought, there's no more to be said here. I know exactly what I'll do. I'll use him, I'll punish him in my own way. I'll use him as an example in a philosophy lecture. So I walked away, and I couldn't help thinking there was something unfair about his action. And my sense of unfairness was that he was polluting for no reason, same time as I'm trying to make an effort to reduce pollution. This is a collective problem. It affects everybody. People are doing things about it. He's not doing anything, same time as enjoying some of our sacrifices. So I felt he was acting unfairly in the following sense. He was free riding on other people's efforts to reduce pollution, noise and air. So I don't know, I'm going to pause here and ask you, how many of you agree with me he was acting unfairly, being in free riding? Hands up. Good. Now, later that week, lots of stories that week. So later that week, my daughter goes to the UCL nursery around the corner. So she was paid a visit by the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, who was launching a new scheme for air pollution called the T-Charge, and informing the public about what needs to be done. It's a silent killer, right? Particularly diesel emissions. Silent killer, he's launching the schemes. And then that got me thinking, am I doing enough to protect my kids from air pollution? Surely I do stuff individually. So I have an air purifier at home. I avoid main roads, go the back street. But is that enough? And I was thinking, well, no, it's not, because no matter how much I try to avoid pollution for my kids, they will still be exposed. am I doing enough? And then it dawned on me, there's nothing I can do individually to solve the problem or address it effectively. I have to engage in coordinated action with other people. Campaign, vote for the right policies when I vote for elections, be an active citizen. It's only if the government, say, bans diesel cars or the mayor introduces a new scheme that something can be done. So that got me thinking about the responsibility towards my own kids. And I was thinking, if I don't do anything about pollution, I'm actually failing my duty towards my kids if I only stay at the individual level. And I have to do something with citizens around me. So how many of you would you agree with me that if I were to do nothing about the problem, I would be failing my responsibility towards my own kids? Hands up. Good. Fewer than before, but still hands up. Great. Now the third thing I want to report from last week, I had a busy week last week with pollution. So the third thing that happened to me is that my son often gets chest infections when there's a cold. So I worried whether pollution might have something to do with it. So I went to the GP, who was an expert on respiratory diseases, and he told me, pollution is bad, but you don't have to worry about it worsening the problem of chest infections. It's not going to be asthma unless there's a history in the family, which we don't have. So he kind of reassured me, you don't have to move out of London. It's not that big a problem. So I took his expert advice on this. He's an expert, so I thought, okay, I don't have to move out of London. But then I started thinking, maybe I should, because things are better outside the center. There's more space. There's stuff I can do for myself, have a more comfortable lifestyle. I now live in a small flat in London, in the center of London. Maybe life is better if I leave. Better for me. But then it dawned on me that if I were to move, I would be taking my son out of school, and he has formed their expectations about his friends, about his social life, his network, his life in London, the museums, the playgrounds, all of that. I would be defeating his expectations about his life for the mere benefit of me having more space and liking my life better further out. Then I thought, if the only benefit is just for me, just making my life a bit better, but the downside is defeating his legitimate expectations about his school, I thought that's kind of unfair towards him. If the only reason I do it and is my own benefit. So how many of you would think that defeating his expectations about his life like that would be unfair? Hands up. Good. Okay, so at least some of you agree with me that these are three kinds of wrongs here identified. One wrong is the wrong of free riding. The second one was the wrong of failing to take part in a shared cooperative scheme with a view to protect your dependents. And the third wrong was the wrong of defeating legitimate expectations of someone merely for your own benefit. So these are three wrongs, and a lot of people think that they identify legitimate ethical principles that we should honor. So now I'm going to ask if Euroscepticism violates or commits any of these three wrongs. And I want to begin with the first one, the wrong of free riding. So I mentioned pollution, and it wasn't an accident. Pollution is a public good. And many economists and theorists define public goods as goods that, if they exist, and one person enjoys them, then everybody else enjoys them as well, without any additional cost. If there's clean air, everybody gets to enjoy it. It's enough for everybody. It's not a finite resource. Also, public goods are goods that are non-excludable. If we have clean air, we cannot exclude those who pollute or try to pollute. They will benefit too. It's either impossible or too costly to exclude people who fail to respect the public good. And now I want to ask, if European supranational institutions produce a public good that everybody in Europe benefits from, and if that is the case, then everybody should do their fair share. And the public good I want to emphasize here, in relation to both the EU and the Council of Europe, is the public good of peace, stability, and the rule of law. Now, this is where the argument gets a bit more controversial. It's partly empirical, but I think there are very strong arguments to show that the EU has contributed crucially to peace, stability, and rule of law in the continent. I don't have to remind anybody here of the two world wars that happened in Europe in the 20th century, and how it's not an accident that we haven't had another one since then, at the same time as the European institutions got off the ground. So suppose, and it's a big if, suppose that without the European institutions, we wouldn't have the peace and stability we enjoy now. Suppose further that a country, say the UK, benefits from peace and stability in the continent. And then suppose further that having those European institutions involves a cost in sovereignty. Shouldn't every country that benefits from the public good of peace and stability incur a fair share of the cost in sovereignty, since they are enjoying this public good? And wouldn't the act of withdrawing from the European Union or the Council of Europe, while continuing to enjoy the benefits of peace and stability and rule of law, be an act of free riding and hence unfair? So here, if all these conditions are met, you have the wrongdoer being the country and the victims being not only the rest of the country, but also the citizens in those countries. Because they would be also incurring the sacrifice in loss of sovereignty to get this public good off the ground, whereas the citizens of that other country refuse to do so. So I think one way in which we can think of Euroscepticism as unfair or unethical is by identifying the wrong of unfairness or free riding. A public good being promoted or produced by the EU and the Council of Europe, countries being benefiting and not doing their fair share. Now I want to raise a bit of a challenge on this first argument, as one must do if we are to be balanced. Here's an objection. Someone might say, well, just because you benefit from something doesn't mean you have obligations to do your fair share. So I don't want to be arrogant, but I really do hope you will benefit from this lecture by being here today. But it would seem kind of odd if I were to charge you at the end of it, right? Or ask you to do something for me as your fair share. So there are clearly cases where people benefit, but they don't acquire obligations to do something. And attending the lecture is one of those things. So there's a bit of a controversy whether the benefits have to be voluntary or not, whether you ask for them. So someone can say, yeah, Britain may benefit from the EU being there, but they didn't ask for the benefit. They're just receiving it, but they didn't ask for it. Why should they incur any cost in their sovereignty? And I think this is a good challenge. Philosophers disagree about whether the benefit has to be voluntary or not, has to be asked for, and so on. But I want to counter this objection by saying that what's important is the kind of benefit you receive. It's not just the benefit from a lecture or something trivial like that. It's the benefit that comes with peace, stability, and the rule of law. And these are goods everybody wants. These are essential goods for any well-ordered democratic society. So even if the UK or any other country in Europe doesn't really want to have those benefits, they didn't ask for them, they don't want them, they're fine without them, they are so important for everybody that I think it's permissible to expect a fair share of producing those public goods. Argument number two. So remember the point about if you have dependents and the only way to help them and carry out your responsibilities by taking part in cooperation with others. Here, it's a different argument. So we live in a globalized world where there's many threats to people's interests. There are corporations that are seeking profits and pushing for standards to be lowered and for deregulation. And the power of those organizations is very big, sometimes bigger than the power of one nation state. What the EU does really well by having a massive single market is to be able to resist those pressures and threats by those corporations. Think of the following example. Google. The European Court of Justice issued a judgment protecting the right to be forgotten on the internet, protecting us, our privacy, against the use of big data by search engines like Google. The reason why EU was able to do that is because of the size of the economy. And the reason why corporations can comply with those rulings is because, again, the size of the economy. No single state would be able to command that authority by themselves. So if I am a country in Europe and I want to protect my citizens' privacy against these threats, what are my options? Try to fight it myself or join in a shared scheme of cooperation for the sake of the rights of my own citizens? It's not, Google is just one example. You can think of regulation of public health and consumer protection in those areas. EU can resist the pressure by trading patterns because of its size, often against the rules of the WTO, for example. So if a state cares for the rights of the citizens, like I care for the health of my son, I have reasons to cooperate if that's the only way to resist the threat from a globalized economy. So if a state doesn't cooperate, they are wronging their own citizens. So those of you who had the hand up in my second question should agree also that the failure of a state to take part in European supranational institutions is unfair or unethical because it amounts basically to undermining the rights of your own people. Now, like the first argument, I want to raise a counter-objection here. And the objection is, what if the people don't want this protection? What if they voted not to have this protection? So in this country, there was a referendum, and it was decided democratically that the people don't want to be part of the EU. So even if we agree with you, George, that the rights of British people are better served by being part of a big single market, people don't want that. They prefer something else. So what's your problem? And here, I want to highlight the limits and problems of any majoritarian process, which is the interests and rights of the worst off in society. Any majoritarian process is inevitably going to support the interests of the many, and it doesn't guarantee due respect for the worst off. And many of the victims of a process of unilateralism, a process of not taking part with other states with a view to counter the threats to people's rights, are the worst off. Consumer protection, public health, pollution. Data shows that these problems that are common problems in Europe are affecting most the worst off, who inevitably wouldn't have a majority in a referendum. It's the poor who suffer from air pollution more than everybody else, from lack of consumer protection or lack of public health. It's going to be the worst off in society. So insofar as any society, as I think they should, care for the worst off, the answer we voted for it is not a good answer. That's my counter-objection to the objection. Now, I now want to move to the third argument, and this was the one from expectations. So here, if we work by analogy between my kid and myself, think about all the European citizens who moved to another EU country and made a life there on the assumption that there's free movement and all the rights conferred by EU law. Following the result of the referendum, these people were treated, as the saying goes, as a bargaining chips. And the question was whether the outcome of the negotiation should protect them or not. And it's up for grabs. Let's sit down and discuss it through negotiations. Very few people make the argument of justice, which is not about some deal to be struck. It's about respecting their legitimate expectations. If anybody who's made a life in a country is told you have to go or you have to apply for this, that, and the other, your conditions for staying are going to deteriorate, when they were reassured, this is a perfectly lawful and permissible way to plan your life. That violates the principle of respecting legitimate expectations of people. So Britons in Europe or non-British EU citizens here who may have to change their lives radically in violation of the principle of legitimate expectations would be victims of a wrong. So again, by analogy, we think that Euroscepticism that results in those people having expectations being defeated are victims of a wrong. That would be unethical. So three cases that I think plausibly count as unethical examples. And I want to close by an observation. In the run-up to the referendum, nobody even bothered making arguments of this kind. The main campaigns, for and against, were cost-benefit. It wasn't whether it was just or unjust to stay or to leave. It was about how much it would cost to the average household, or arguments of identity. Do you feel European or not? But arguments of cost and benefit are not arguments of ethical principle. It's like asking, do I have reasons to keep paying a gym subscription, even if I don't go very, very often? It's like asking whether you want to be in a gym or a club. Whereas the arguments I rehearsed here today are not about cost benefit. It's about there being a wrong, a victim, and a wrongdoer, and an ethical principle behind it. It is with great sadness that I didn't see those arguments being made in the campaign on either side. And the arguments focused on identity, do you feel British or European, or cost benefit. And I think it's time we move away from those arguments. Economists can make them. They usually disagree anyway, how much off, better off, or worse off you are. And identity arguments are not really arguments. You either feel European or you don't. There's nothing you can argue about. Yet we keep arguing about Brexit, and we keep arguing about the European Union. Why do you argue? We don't argue about cost benefits. We don't argue about identity. We argue ultimately about ethics. And I think there's a pretty strong case that undermining European institutions is unethical. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, George, and apologies, I had my Theresa May moment here. So we've got another 5 or 10 minutes, I think, to take questions, and I'd be very glad to hear from you. I will be taking probably 2 at a time, and if you could wait for the microphone to reach you, I'd be grateful. So we'll have the gentleman here and then the lady in the second row.
Hi, thank you very much. I found that very interesting. I can understand your logic up to a certain point. I'm a reluctant Remainer. I canvassed in London and outside of London to stay, but I heard what people were saying. So therefore, isn't it unethical not to take the democratic voice of people in a referendum, whether you like it or not? Because people did see that the EU didn't present for them a public good.
Okay. I'll take 2 at a time.
Talking about the protection that supranational organizations may give us against transnational corporations who might be acting against our best interests, why is it that the EU defined, quote, safe, unquote, limits for diesel emissions are 8 times greater than the American defined safe limits? And why is it that the federal government in America has managed to take 24 billion US dollars from Volkswagen so far, and it hasn't finished, and the states themselves haven't finished yet either, and the EU has taken nothing?
Okay, so
And I hazard a guess that it might be because VW is in bed with the German government. I would also mention that South Korea, 15 months ago, took all Volkswagen cars, every mark of Volkswagen cars, VW, Seat, Skoda, Audi, Porsche, off the roads. They just took them off the roads. They weren't waiting until 2050.
Thank you. So we have one question on the ethicality of the democratic votes being respected, and another specific to the pollution case. George.
Good. So thank you for your questions. So it's really difficult to be raising this question now after the referendum. So beforehand, it was crucial because you want to tell voters, look, think about this dimension of the question. And you're saying, well, they thought about it, and they said, we don't think it's unethical, so we're going to go. And now have to respect it. To me, it's crucial, first, two things: the procedure by which the referendum took place. Was there a fair process? Was there enough time? Were the percentages as they should? So one problem I see, for example, that EU citizens who live in this country and are directly affected didn't get to vote, for example, as they did get to vote in the Scottish referendum. The percentage of turnout and majority, again, was, by referendum standards around the world, very low. There was no limited number, and it was just 50% over. Whereas for many major changes in the constitution, you have more increased percentages. So I have a number of complaints about the process, right? So that leads me to doubt whether the outcome should be respected. But even if the process were fair, 100%, I would like to think there are some issues of ethical principle that no majoritarian process can shut down as concerns. And issues of rights, fundamental rights, for example, should be respected even against what the public might at different times think. So I think for any majoritarian process, referenda, nonetheless, should be limits imposed by the need to protect rights, particularly those of the most vulnerable in society. So there was a point why I mentioned the worst off, because in any majoritarian process, the worst off won't get enough attention. So that's why I think this question still is very important. On your question about the actual facts, so is the EU taking on the multinational corporations? Are they doing a better job than states? For every case I give you, you might give me a different case, and I agree. There are all these areas in which the EU is not doing a good job at all. I'll be the first to say. However, we have to look at the bigger picture. Is getting together with other nations in a single market more likely to counter the threats by each state going at it alone? In the ideal case, like an ideal nation state, a very good one, well-ordered, just, and an ideal EU. Which of the two is more likely? If the answer is the supranational institution, then let's work for it, as opposed to say, oh, let's go back to the nation state. It's like asking, finding out that London ambulance drivers don't do a good job at driving ambulances. And they're reacting as follows, saying, well, let's not have ambulances. No, the answer should be, let's get a better ambulance, better drivers. So if the EU is not doing a good job, but it's the best hope against those threats, the answer should be, let's improve the EU.
Gentleman over here, and the lady at the back.
Thank you very much. Could you say a little about why you think there was a failure of adequate ethical dialogue and what ought to be done about that in society in general, please? Thank you.
So I'm not originally from this country. I've lived my life 20 years here, so I have a British nationality, and I admire a lot this country, but I always struck by how matters of European interaction were thought of as, or rather were thought of in a transactional way. It's a transaction whereby let's see if we are better off. And that's not really how people in this country think about other matters. But when it came to the European Union and European institutions, that was the attitude. And it was very hard to shake it, I realized. And that's why I think both campaign sides went down the route of economics. Or you're better off this way, you're better off that way. But my intuitive reaction would be, if you pitch economics against identity, identity is going to win. So if people don't feel so committed to the EU as part of the identity, they're not going to be moved by the economic argument. But if you make the ethical argument, that's going to be a different story. And I think very few people try to do that. I think Gordon Brown at some point tried to make an argument of that kind. But it wasn't a mainstream campaigning at all. What can we do to change that? What I'm doing now, hopefully engage people. And I think here the role of universities is crucial. So those of you who've been following the news the last couple of weeks will have picked up that we were criticized for taking sides. But I think that's what's important, not the side you take, but the arguments you give. Right? And we've heard enough from economists. They don't agree anyway. Let's hear more from arguments of principle. So I think that's all we can do.
Yes, I think you overestimate the European Union and what it's able to do. I mean, actually, even on pollution, the UK has tougher, actually, targets on carbon emissions than the European Union. Also on the question of peace. I mean, we've had a terrible war in the Balkans. It was not stopped by any and as to keeping the peace, it's more down to NATO than anything than the EU. But I mean, on the sort of what you're talking about, sort of deeper ethical issues, I mean, most people in the UK, I mean, I campaigned for Brexit, for leave. I'm probably a minority of one here or something. And talking to people, I mean, what they don't like about the EU is it's a top-down entity. And so that they feel, and I feel, that the source of ethics and law, say in the UK, is much more to do with our own common law as it's evolved, right? Which is different from top-down sort of ideologies coming out of Europe, whether that's the human rights or the stuff coming from the European Court. Because where does that come from? I mean, it seems to be something imposed. That's why, you know, the Brexit slogan of "Take back control" was brilliant. It encapsulates exactly how people feel disempowered by these top-down kind of stuff. And I just want to say that I lived a long time and worked in the Soviet Union. And it was a kind of a similar sort of situation. The whole establishment was suffused with the ideology, Soviet ideology, but not the people. They felt disempowered. And there was a huge gap that widened and widened and widened until it was blown apart. And in a sense, there's similar dangers, are there not, with the European Union? That it's top down. It's got lots of crises, whether that's Euro, the mass migration, and now nationalism and Catalonia and populism. And
Sorry,
these things have arisen.
Can you draw it to a close?
Yeah, just
so we can take another question as well, please.
Yeah. Do you think, therefore, that actually you've posed it as we being unethical, but actually our ethics are perfectly sound, and they derive from somewhere else.
Good. So on your first point about peace, I don't really agree that it's NATO really that's doing, because NATO is using deterrence, whereas in Europe, what the European Union is doing is internalizing norms of stability, rule of law, and peace, and taking out incentives deeply embedded in nation states to engage in aggression. So deterrence is a short-term tool. Ideally, you want the values to be internalized by states, and that's what the EU has done, I think. So I don't agree with you that there are other ways, or NATO is actually more effective. On the issue of ethics, I don't see the EU norms being top-down any more than they are in the nation states. First of all, human rights are not top-down. It's your human rights, my human rights, people in this room human rights. So that's not top-down, it's ours. And they're being upheld far better than the European Court of Human Rights than the way in this country by domestic courts. So the argument that it's someone else's ethics, not ours, it's not there. Human rights are universal, and the rights we have in EU law are rights of everybody, including us in this country. So I don't think their ethics and our ethics. It's everybody's ethics, and the question is who is doing a better job at protecting them. And you and I take a different view about this, but I think it is a shared ethics, and I think to honor them, we really have to cooperate with others.
I'm afraid we have only time for one more question, and can I please ask you to make it brief? So it's the gentleman over there.
I'll be very quick. I want to know, you said that the process was unfair in the European referendum, that the Electoral Commission said that no EU citizens could vote in this country apart from Cyprus, Ireland and Maltese. I want to know whether this is a basis of taking the government to court and arguing that the process was unfair and thereby initiating a second referendum.
Good. So in my view, it's not just who was eligible to vote, it's also the money spent on campaigning. A big question mark there about the amount and the use that money was put. And I think the framework there is very weak of how money is spent in campaigns for referenda. Now, whether a court, if you're asking my prediction about whether any court will do something about it, I'm very pessimistic. If you're asking my view about whether a court should find this to be a problem, I would say yes. Now, there's another worry, though, here that if a referendum is done, like any election, there are other reasons not to undo the result. So even if there was an unfair process, the response by any court should not be to undo the outcome because of the effects it already has produced for political and other actors. So that's really something to be looked at for the next referendum, as opposed to try to undo the results that already have taken place. So I agree with you that it's an issue of law and process, but it's not really something we can do now much about.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, George, for the lecture, and to you for your very good question. I think this is hopefully the answer to some of what we've heard in the press lately, that this is an area where universities can host a robust debate, and I hope you've been able to pose your questions as such and feels like that. So thank you very much to everybody for being here.
Thank you. Thank you very much.